All right, so hello everyone who's physically here, or watching online, or watching from the future. I am Umut Eldem. I'm a composer, I'm a musician, I'm a pianist, keyboard player, and in the Royal Conservatoire of Antwerp I teach music theory, music history, and electronic music. I'm coordinating there the research group Creatie, and I'm an art researcher myself. In fact, I'm about to finish my PhD on a project on synesthesia, more specifically understanding and applying synesthesia, pseudosynesthesia, and cross-model correspondences in the contemporary artistic practice, analysis, and performance. Which is a fancy way to say I make visual music, I make audio-visual arts, and I'm doing this as an outsider because I do not have sound to color synesthesia. So, in this presentation that I've entitled Multimodal and Pseudosynesthetic Systems in Visual Music Composition, Applying Color Harmony to the Musical Process, I am going to talk a bit about this. And since we don't have much time, I will focus more specifically on how I figure out color palettes and how I apply color to the harmony in the music and audiovisual art that I create. But of course, I'm not a music history teacher if I don't talk a bit about history of things. So I just briefly want to talk about people who might not be synesthetes but still had very strong ideas on correspondences between notes and colors. And even though this has a very large, a very big history, maybe a good place to start is Alexander Newton, because he's the guy who figured out how light splits into different colors. And his treatise on light, entitled Optics, he does mention at some point a correspondence between colors and notes. And he claims this to be scientific, right? Because there are 7 colors and there are 7 notes, and of course they are supposed to be related. And we see later, some of you will recognize this handsome chap here, Jean Castel, who was one of the first people to attempt a color instrument, an instrument that would project or result in a color as well as music, or at least reflect the qualities of music in the form of color. Right? And this was also taken further by Alexander Wallace Remington, that you might know as one of the first people to design, to invent a color organ. With which he also, of course, brought forward a whole theory on color music and how a new color art would be created by applying ideas of music theory into the realm of color to really create a sort of an abstraction. Now, why I'm talking about this? Because in my own research, in my own artistic practice, a central question is, of course, how do I take, as a non-synesthete, or at least a non-sound to color synesthete, how do I take notes and how do I take colors and how do I put them together in a way that makes sense, that makes sense to me, that makes sense to an audience, and maybe if I'm lucky even makes sense to some synesthetes. And looking at these historical figures and their own ideas on how to combine notes with colors, I have seen that this usually relates to the rainbow and the chromatic scale. Right? Of course, I don't want to get too much into music theory, but you might be familiar with the idea that the scale in Western music has 12 notes, and usually the application of colors to these notes by such scientists and music people is to just take the rainbow, the entire spectrum, and just put it step by step. As you go up an octave, you go through the rainbow of colors. Which is fantastic, it makes for some fascinating, awesome visuals, but it does not always resonate with an audience. Right, and also in 1895, a review from the Times, a review of Performance by Alexander Wallace Remington, says something similar. It says that while the music was pretty cool, it also seemed unsatisfying and did not convey the same impression to the mind as the music. Of course, this makes sense also in the term that it is just color, isn't it? And in the real world, color isn't only color. It has shape, it has movement, it has some kind of form. It is always combined with other colors. Right? And for this, after doing this research, I went forward and looked at research on cross-model connections, research on synesthesia, and I've discovered something interesting. This is something we have seen, I think, at the very beginning of this conference with the presentation of Julius Sidner, as well as testimonials by certain synesthetes, which is the fact that certain cross-model correspondences do exist in certain synesthetic experiences, even though synesthesia is 100% idiosyncratic, everyone has their own colors. Gather enough people, gather enough data, and sometimes you see certain trends appear. And this does correlate at some points with the cross-model experience of non-synesthetes. So in this example, for example, you can see that certain musical genres, certain musical characteristics do correspond with certain color palettes. This is of course a relatively simplistic study, but we do see that fast-paced major music versus slow-paced minor music. So we immediately have a spectrum between the major scale, which is perceived as being happy, and the minor scale, which is perceived as being sad. Fast music, slow music. But also certain musical genres. And if we take out certain semiotic codings, such as Irish music being green, where most people will say, yeah, duh, Ireland, green, Irish music, fantastic. Then also with classical music we see this, also with rock and pop music we see this. Which brings forward an important question. What is genre? What is the difference between these different genres of music? And genre, the musical genre, is a collection of musical parameters. It's the application of certain notes, certain scales, certain codes, instruments, timbres, forms, rhythm, performance practice, and of course semiotic information, again back to the Irish music. So if we really take apart the concept of genre to its basic forms, we do see that there are some cross-model and synesthetic responses to the emergent property of music, how all of these different parameters come together and interact with each other. Right? And we do see this in the synesthetic expression of composers. At the beginning of my research, I have taken certain synesthetic composers, such as Olivier Messiaen and Michael Torg, and also arguably synesthetic composers. For the purposes of this presentation, I will call Scriabin pseudo-synesthete. And I've looked at how they apply their own colors when they compose music, aware of their synesthesia. Right, so this is important. I'm not talking about what they experience when they hear music. I'm talking about how they express a certain color in their own music, even if they don't agree on the color. And I have seen that there are some correspondences between these composers, that if a synesthetic composer, musician, is composing red, expressing themselves in red, we do see elements of high complexity, dissonance, fast tempi, complex rhythm, sudden change, major tonality, and upwards motion. And if we go from warm colors to colder colors, we start seeing the opposite. No matter what the choice of key or the association is for these composers, their music, their synesthetic expression of the colors blue, violet, purple, show elements of low complexity, consonants, slow tempi, simple rhythms, repetition, minor tonality, and downwards motion. This seems to match up with the cross-model expression of non-synesthetes as well, and this was my starting point for constructing a system of visualization, a system of audio-visual composing for my own artistic practice. Right? And this brought forward an important distinction for me in my own practice, which is between audiovisual spaces and cross-model spaces. An audiovisual space is the combination of the possibilities of sound and visual combinations, and a recursive combination of these elements within different dimensions. This essentially relates to the synesthetic experience, where you might have a color for each note, or each scale, or each chord type, or each instrument. They're all categorized. You have a whole list of things that you can use in your own artistic practice or in your own experience of sound and music. But as a non-sound to color synesthete, as a visual music composer, I have found the concept of cross-model spaces more intriguing. Which is, it's a small difference, it's the possibilities of sound and visual axioms, and the possibilities within the utilization of these axioms in the performance practice. This essentially means coming up with rules and concepts that relate to not only sound, but also color. For example, changes in harmonic density, in harmonic consonance and dissonance, in timbral elements, in form, in rhythm. How do these modulate the existing color? How do they modulate the existing shape? Doing this little switch made it possible to come up with new forms of expression within the visual realm. And again, this is a very wide topic, so I want to just focus on the generation of the color palette and applying it to 12 tones that is used in Western music. As I've said, normally the application would be the would be taking the chromatic scale and then just adding the rainbow or hue spectrum, but that does not reflect the harmonic reality, right? Normally, notes do not exist in a vacuum. They relate to each other in chords, in scales, and in modulations between different chords and scales. A nice way of visualizing this, let me see my cursor, yes, is the concept of a harmonic or a scale lattice, where you would take a central note, which we would call tonic in music theory, and you would look at the distance between that note and the other notes in terms of intervals, as in, are these consonant, are these dissonant? If I collect some of these notes, which kind of tension and release qualities would I have in my musical cognition? This is a different way of representing notes and scales than just having a chromatic scale rising from bottom to top or top to bottom. And this was my starting point for applying a color palette onto this harmonic lattice. I would take the tonic note, the main note, and give it an arbitrary association, as I don't have sounds to color synesthesia, but as green is my favorite color, I would say, for example, okay, this C, it's green. I love the color green. I love the note C. Some of you might disagree with me with this association, but that's how I want to handle it. And afterwards, I would also create a sound color lattice, as in, okay, if this is my distance between different notes harmonically, what would the color distance be? What would the distance be in color space? What would the differences be in hue and brightness and saturation? And while this is a parameter that can be tinkered with based on one's preferences, it immediately reveals a certain palette that does relate to the harmonic content of the music that exists. And for those of you that would experience this sheet music in color, this might be a bit cringy for you, but this is how I would relate that color scheme onto a piece in F major, where the tonic F would be green and all of the other colors would relate to it. And this immediately generates an artistic heat map of the harmonic content, where there is harmonic tension, where there are incongruent or dissonant chords and scale applications. We do see it immediately in this visualization. So in a strictly cross-model sense, this kind of color palette, when applied in artistic audiovisual creation, would reflect the cognitive experience of harmony in Western music. And of course, I should talk a bit about how I apply this to my own artistic practices. So I will show this in a second. This is a piece by me called Shallow Steps, where I have used a custom synth, so a custom musical engine, together with a visual engine. For this, I have used a MIDI keyboard and a rolling block, which is a 3D, which is a 3D touchpad, which facilitated individual control of the sound and visual parameters using this tone color palette. Well, let's see how it looks. First of all, this was performed live in Brussels and in Antwerp, so I would really be playing and drawing on the screen with my own colors and my own palette. And secondly, I found it really interesting that the combination of all of these tones, for some people, would be perceived as a singular timbre, because this is essentially a collection of certain frequencies appearing all together. Right, and this was not the stopping point, of course. I just want to briefly show, not this, but two other works. Briefcase of the Infinite Maze is an installation, an online and also physical installation, where people are invited to look at a fractal. A fractal is a very cool mathematical shape that can go on forever if you have seen those 8-hour YouTube videos and did some drugs. But you don't need to do drugs for this, for I have actually created an algorithm that lets you go through this fractal, complete interactive, and it generates a soundscape based on the colors of the fractal, where they are standing, how do they relate to each other, which kind of shapes and borders do they have. Right, and again, this is all being generated live, so this is a live computer vision analysis of the colors, but it is tempered with this theory of creating color palettes and looking at the cognitive relationship between sound and vision. And lastly, I want to talk about what I'm currently working on, which is the addition of another dimension, movement and muscle tension. I have been collaborating with the artist, pianist, researcher Giusy Caruso in creating a new work called Intentions. You can see that she has these very cool armbands here. These are called myogram bracelets, which is not only an accelerometer as it follows her hand movements, but it also acts as a muscle sensor. So any kind of tension that her elbow has while playing the piano or doing other gestures is also transformed into data and sent to my computer, which I then visualized, of course, here shown on a TV screen, which is once again completely arbitrary. The shape, the color is from my own artistic choosing. But how it is tempered, how the colors change and how it reacts is dependent on the content of the music and the movement of the pianist. This is a very interesting way of augmenting the musician without being too intrusive, using simple sensors and tools to get data from the movements of the musician as well as the sound they make, which leads to some interesting applications such as this. Just going to fast forward a bit. So you're very welcome, of course, if you are nearby. And last but not least, the conclusions. So, this whole presentation is essentially a long way of saying, one, the pseudo-synesthetic music color experience may reflect the emergent property of musical parameters in creating the complete musical experience. Two, the mapping of color-related parameters to musical functions as opposed to ordered elements facilitates cross-modal spaces. And lastly, such cross-modal spaces can be used not only in the audiovisual performance practice, but also in the audiovisual creative, the compositional process as well. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Umut. It was very, very interesting. But maybe for people who are not programming music and visuals, it's a little bit difficult So I will ask all these people in our audience, are there any questions? And all the others can ask questions too.
Thank you, Umut, for such an amazing work, from theory to the development of the applications and the aesthetic experience provided. A lot of very interesting things in your short presentation. Fascinating things. I've been thinking about these things for years, and I didn't have the competence to implement them this way. But I was wondering here two things, if you know the theory of digital harmony of John Whitney, which also could collaborate in a certain level with the things you are doing. And also there's a Brazilian composer called Jorge Antunes, contemporary music composer, pioneer of electronic music in Brazil. Have you heard about him? Jorge Antunes.
I don't know that composer, so let's definitely talk about him afterwards. But John Whitney, Digital Harmony, was one of the inspirations for my work. That might be visible to you if you're familiar with John Whitney. But my one critique of John Whitney is that he always went for the obvious mathematical correlations between intervals and geometry. And there needs to be some space for the cognitive experience as well, because we are not computers, we are human beings, and we do not always perceive everything as mathematical correlations.
Right. I have written an article about him, and I was surprised when you read his book that he's very conservative in terms of aesthetics. And he criticizes experimental cinema and a lot of other things. It's very funny, but the theory is interesting and the films are very beautiful. Antunes has a theory he calls chromophonics, where my own work started. And he found relations, some perceptual similarities between the relations, mathematical relations between the harmonics and music, and the complementary colors in the color spectrum. Very interesting findings. Okay, we can talk about this later, but I think you will enjoy. Thank you very much. Amazing work.
My pleasure.
This was amazing. Thank you so much. You mentioned in the beginning the idea of, like, if somebody just maps the rainbow to a scale, you get things that don't resonate with people. And I think we all understand that in a really fundamental way. But have you tried at all in this process, were there any steps for, like, measuring when things resonate with people? And I think it's a funny question because we have, like, a very tuned in, very sensitive audience, but whenever I am listening to music or looking at art, I think of that as one of the most important things that makes art powerful. And I'm just curious if you know, were you looking for that? Did you encounter it, you know, in ways that are maybe not mathematical, but are ways that are just anecdotal?
Yes, that is something I've considered, of course, both with synesthetes and non-synesthetes. There have been projects of me collaborating with synesthetic musicians as well. That's for another presentation. But my challenge with that was the fact that it's incredibly subjective, right? And this audience might resonate with what I'm doing, and some other people might say, it doesn't make sense to me, I would prefer the rainbow over the chromatic scale compared to what you are doing, it's horrible, which is also fine. Right, but I think we have to consider the cultural context as well, because this and the online audience is incredibly international. And what I am doing here in this specific situation is Western music. It's 12 tones, octave divided into 12, applying colors also maybe in a Western way or tempered with the Western way. So I would be very interested into looking at different kinds of music, non-Western music, and how these visual ideas apply to those rhythmical concepts, for example, the Indian conical. right? That's approach to rhythm that's completely different than what is happening in the West, would look visualized.
I have a question. I think it could be wonderful if you would have maybe 5 dancers with your muscle sensors. Is your computer able to get all the data and translate them to colors, or would you need some more players with your programs?
I have a very sad computer because I'm always pushing it to its limits, and sometimes I can hear it crying. So of course that's a technical question, right? So of course more computers are always appreciated, more technical personnel and expertise is always appreciated, but something I try to do is to keep things simple, because the more computers you have, the more sensors you have, and the more musicians and more disciplines you have, as in dancers and visual artists and musicians, it becomes wonderful, but it becomes very difficult to manage. Right now we are collaborating with a dancer also to take this to the next level, but I think for me and for my computer that is the limits, but eventually a really big large-scale project with some really cool computers and really cool artists would be very welcome.
We have some online questions. Greta Beermann.
Yes, perhaps you addressed this, I'm not quite sure, but you said you didn't have sound to color synesthesia. Do you have other forms of synesthesia?
Yes, I do. It's a good question. I should have mentioned that as well. I do have calendar synesthesia, so the days of the week and months of the year are colored for me. But I do have, and this is something I discovered after I started my doctoral research, I do have a relationship between music, more specifically chords, and texture in my mouth. Right? This is not taste. I don't taste things as I hear music, but upon hearing certain chords, especially in jazz music, I do have the feeling of a round shape, or I don't know, something spiky, or some other kind of texture in my mouth, as if I'm eating a lemon. But again, this is not the taste, it's just a feeling of texture in my mouth.
Thank you, Umut. We will talk about this later.
Absolutely.
And thank you very much for your great presentation. And I want to see the next presentations and when you're playing in Brussels or Antwerp.
Of course. Thank you again for listening, everyone.
Now we invite Cici Hart from San Francisco. Cici is talking about the body curious. Can 3D printed haptic objects foster empathy in a gallery audience?
Hello everyone, I need just a quick moment